Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical themes in Mexico's 0-0 draw with Poland. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on Mexico's shape, then we'll shift to their wide play, and lastly we'll focus on Poland's second half adjustment. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Mexico in a neutral color so it doesn't clash with the pitch, and you can see them in what looks to be a 4-1-2-3, but it is a variation of a 4-3-3, and Poland also playing in more of a 4-1-4-1. So the first tactical theme that we do have to break down is Mexico's shape against Poland's non-existent pressing, because when you look at how Poland were set up, they should have been capable to cope with Mexico's attack. You have the wide players closing down the fullbacks, you have 3v3 in that midfield zone, so you have the shuttlers pushing out to Herrera and Chavez, and then you could have the lone single pivot stepping out to Alvarez, and if you had one of the shuttlers stepping out to Alvarez, you could simply have the holder covering for the spare man. The other option that Poland had here was that they could have Lewandowski dropping on Alvarez, and that would allow the center backs to push forward, and if he wanted to apply pressure, he could simply block off the passing lane in towards the holding midfielder. Out in the wider areas, it should have been the fullbacks against the wide players, and then 2v1 against Martin. However, what we ended up seeing was that there was no press from Poland, and that enabled Mexico to play out of the back with relative ease. This is not to say that there weren't times where Lewandowski was sitting on Alvarez or Zielinski did push forward to close him down. However, what ended up happening was that the center backs were able to carry the ball freely, and then there were situations where they were simply able to slide the ball in towards Alvarez if he shifted laterally away from Lewandowski's movement. The only other alternative that we witnessed from Poland here was that they had the shuttlers stepping out towards the center backs, but that left one of the Mexican shuttlers free, and that would force the lone pivot to shift across to provide cover. He struggled to get towards the spare Mexican player in time, and those moves often resulted in Mexico combining with the wide players and getting themselves into dangerous positions in the final third to weary the Polish backline. So as you can see, the center backs were able to play the ball through the midfield with relative ease. Alvarez was capable of getting on the ball and progressing Mexico's play, and the other alternative for the Mexican center backs were to play long diagonal balls out towards Lozano or Gallardo, who was pushing forward. Whereas there's a clear contrast in the manner in which Mexico approached the game without the ball. You could see that Martin was pressing the two center backs energetically, and from there it left a 3v3 battle in that midfield zone. You could see Alvarez stepping forward to close down the single pivot and then have the shuttlers dealing with the Polish shuttlers, or you could simply have Martin dropping off the single pivot and then looking to step forward to the Polish center backs when they look to push forward. There was also the alternative with Martin dropping off the single pivot and then seeing Chavez push forward to close down the center backs, and then there's still 2v2 in that midfield zone. But for the most part, what ended up happening was that the press was led by the striker and he was willing to close down both center backs. They were able to maintain their shape in the 3v3 battle in that midfield zone, and for large spells of that game, Mexico's pressing disrupted Poland's build-up, forcing them to play long balls over the top in which they struggled to win, and even in the cases when Lewandowski was able to brush off a center back or hold up the play, Poland struggled to win the second ball and the flick-ons were unsuccessful. That gets us to the Mexican shape. What we ended up seeing was that there was varied movement on both sides of the pitch, and a lot of what Mexico did stemmed through the positioning of their shuttlers dropping off deeper in towards the half space to allow the player hugging the touchline that was providing the width, time, and space on the ball, and then we'd see inverted movement from the other players. For instance, on the left-hand side, Vega was often drifting into space between the lines or into pockets of space in those areas, and then you would see Gallardo pushing forward to peg back the Polish wide player. At times that would leave Poland in a back five and they look like more of a 5-4-1, but Gallardo was stretching the pitch down the left-hand side, and he was often an outlet for diagonal balls, but unfortunately when he got into those zones on a consistent basis, he was struggling to have an impact. Ultimately, the issue that Poland were encountering here, when we witnessed this in one of Mexico's best moves in the opening half, was that Chavez was dropping off into pockets of space in a deeper inside left position, Kaminsky was being pegged back, and then Vega was pulling away cash. So what ended up happening was that Chavez had time on the ball to pick out the run of Gallardo breaking in behind, and that served as a legitimate focal attacking point for Mexico. The other alternative for Mexico down that left-hand side was that Vega would drop deeper in towards that left half space to get on the ball. You witnessed Chavez pushing forward into that space between the lines to occupy a center back, and then Gallardo would stretch the pitch down the touchline. On the right-hand side, what we ended up seeing was that Herrera was dropping off deeper to pick up the ball in those positions, and now you would see Sanchez moving in towards a narrow position to peg back the wide player. From there, Lozano was often capable of getting the ball freely and getting into 1v1s, but his impact didn't result in him beating the Polish left back down the byline. What we often saw was that he was looking to play balls in towards the underlapping runs of Sanchez breaking in towards the half space, or there were situations where Sanchez was the deepest player and Herrera was pushing in towards space between the lines to occupy a center back and then making underlapping runs in towards the half space to serve as a threat. So over on that right hand side, Lozano was stretching the pitch and looking to play in the underlapping runs of Sanchez and Herrera, and if that wasn't the case, he would use those underlapping runs to drag away markers and then cut across the fullback and then look to play the ball in towards Martin checking in towards it, and from there Martin would look to play the ball back to Lozano or play it towards the underlapping movement of Sanchez. In terms of the second half, the major tactical shift witnessed Poland shift to more of a 4-4-2 in terms of their pressing. While it could have been more of a 4-2-3-1 as Zielinski is a central attacking midfielder, he was helping Lewandowski with the press, and you could see that Poland were doing a much better job of ensuring that Mexico couldn't build out of the back easily. So what you'd end up seeing was that Lewandowski would step towards a center back and then Zielinski would drop off on Alvarez, and vice versa. If Zielinski pushed forward to close down a center back, you'd see the Polish striker dropping off to try and close down Alvarez. The only other option that they could have was to sit in between Alvarez and allow the center backs forward and press accordingly. And then in those situations, that leaves the two central midfielders capable of dealing with Herrera and Chavez. Poland looked a bit more structured in this pressing scheme, and it ensured that Mexico couldn't peg them back in towards their own third. The issue here was that Tata Martino then instructed Alvarez to drop in between the center backs to make it a three-man backline and make it a 3v2. That would push the fullbacks forward, and now you ended up seeing Poland encountering some issues. And even when you break down the build-up to Lewandowski's penalty, you could see that Mexico are capable of building out of that press because you have the wide player closing down the fullback, but you still have the 3v2 in that zone. But it's when the Polish front two are bypassed, you witness the recovery on Alvarez to force a mistake, and then from there you could see that Poland are now capable of breaking in transition. Lewandowski is capable of winning the ball in around the final third, breaking through challenges from the center backs, and then being fouled in the penalty area. So as you could see, although Poland's non-existent pressing played a key role in Mexico's territorial dominance in the opening half, it was solely Mexico's varied movement in wide areas that created issues, and despite the European side system change providing minimal impact, it still led to the game's defining moment.